Thanks, Jen. And I'm a total fraud. I don't think I'm actually going to be speaking to that title entirely. It's one of the reasons why I don't have slides. I very rarely go naked and slide free, but I decided to do that today. It's probably a measure of how I certainly don't want to project a sense of I'm an expert in co-production and risk and safety and all those things. Absolutely not. I'm head of programme for trauma at NES. I'm a clinical by background. And I guess I'm here speaking because I've been thinking about some of the things that the impact of trauma brings to the table in terms of when we think about particularly around risk to the process of co-production as well as risks to everybody involved. So I think of it as being this extra thing at the table that if we're going to be trauma informed, and by trauma informed, I don't just mean resisting re-traumatization. I mean, how do we design a system and a process that actively expects the impact of trauma to come to the table and has worked out, right, this is what this is likely to do, and this is how we do this in a successful way to be able to manage and mitigate that. Because we need it at the table. We want it at the table. You know, it brings massive pluses to it. It's why we're doing this work, is we need to understand processes, systems, and policies from the perspective of the lived experience of trauma. But in doing that, we have to expect the impact of trauma, and it's all this good, bad, resilience, challenges, way, and all the bits to it to show up to that table and make itself known. And if we're not, and I think when Shamela says, if it's not getting messy, it's not getting done, I think that's what she means by that. But at the same time, we can't just leave it at if it's not getting messy, it's not getting done. Well, then how do you manage that mess so it doesn't pose a risk? It doesn't pose a risk to the people at the table. And it doesn't pose a risk, you know, maybe I'm being too pragmatic here, but when I think about risk, I think about, well, we want to do this great. We want to do this really well. We want co-production to meaningfully mean that we change systems and processes in there. So when I think about risk, I think about what's the risk that bringing the impact of trauma to the table means or brings about for effective changing of systems with the lived experience of trauma in that. So that's a bit of a long fitting it, but really all I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to do this very briefly because there are people who are doing this stuff. I'm not doing this stuff, so I'm a fraud right up front. So I want to give as much time as possible to people who are actually doing this stuff and just maybe spend 5 or 10 minutes going, well, what are the kind of risks that the impact of trauma can bring to the table? I don't have solutions to it. I've got some thoughts around that, but that's where we're that's what we're starting with. So that Menti just blew my mind, by the way. I wish I'd seen it, you know, ago when I started thinking about it. Very interesting to see kind of all those different ideas about what do we mean by risk and what do we mean by what, you know, what that looks like. And I certainly am not going to kind of bring all of those things up, but it's helpful because they are the things I was thinking about. I suppose I always like to do this at the beginning. I'm speaking as an expert by profession, not an expert by experience. That means I've got blind spots. And others of us will be speaking from different expertise, so they'll have blind spots, but that's why we have everybody in the way. But I hold my hands up to not being able to speak to a range of things because I'm blind. I love the phrase that John Breer, very high level training to our very high level people, kept on referring to us all as bozos on the same bus. Like, we're all bozos on the same bus in the human experience, and we all bring that experience to the table. And on top of that, I bring a bit of trauma expertise. Other people bring other bits of different expertise. So before I kind of go on to what does trauma look like when it pitches up to the table and what might that look like for risk, I think we need some definitions here. And I think the first definition, which that Menti has covered, so maybe I don't need this, is what do we mean by risk? Of what, to what, and from what? So of what? And to me, the biggest thing is actually about success or failure of the aims of co-production, as well as, and a part of that is if we're re-traumatizing people in the process of co-production, well, then that's going to make the process fail in and of itself. So that's our first step in trying to make sure that we're going to be successful in co-production, is let's not introduce additional trauma into people's lives or re-traumatization, which is different to additional trauma, but nonetheless is exacerbating pre-existing. But it's not just that. It's also about kind of how are we making sure that we think about the impact of trauma as a partner in this process of co-production, and how at every stage of the way we're thinking how it might interfere with, how it might help, or how it might create barriers to what we're trying to do. And I'm being intentionally a bit vague there because what we're trying to do is going to be different in different places and different organizations. Sometimes we'll be looking at policies, thinking how does this policy, how is it trauma informed, how is it not trauma informed, how does it take into account the impact? And that process might be a committee that's coming together to discuss it, to make statements, to think about it together, and different people. as opposed to how is this environment trauma informed? That might be a very different process by which people are. So of what? Success or failure of the aims of co-production, whatever that. To what? Well, the risk to negative impact and re-traumatization on people with lived experience of trauma, but also on the organisation. So we can't leave the organisation out in the cold and go, well, it's the big powerful entity that's got all the power here. So, you know, we don't need to think about it. We absolutely need to think about the organisation, because the organisation is made up of people. We're all human beings. And people set up systems maybe in non-trauma informed ways, but for other reasons that they might cling to, for reasons that work for them. And so it is about understanding from a systemic organisational perspective, how has this been set up in this non-trauma informed way? What is it you're going to have to give up that might create a risk for your organisation if we did it this way? And how do we work together to mitigate and manage that risk? So we're thinking about organisations. And also, we talk a lot in NES about the window of tolerance of organisations and the impact of trauma and stress on organisations. And so we need to think about trauma pitching up to the table in a systemic organisation. And then from what, and I think I've been clear about that, for me, there's lots of other risks as well. So it's not that we're saying trauma creates the only risk to this process. It's just that that's what we're talking about. And that kind of brings me on to my next bit is, you know, so what do we mean by embedding the lived experience of trauma? All too often, sometimes, about co-production and about power sharing, I see the words of lived experience. And I think, lived experience of what? Because when we talk about professional experience, we talk about I'm a nurse or I'm a psychologist or I'm a, you know, so I talk about my professional experience is in trauma. And so lived experience of, and I think in not defining that it's lived experience of trauma, we're really negating the powerful, you know, richness and depth that lived experience of trauma, the importance of thinking about all of those different elements that brings. And so there's lots that we've learned previously from literature around generic co-production and power. And I'm not going to talk huge amounts about that today, because A, it'd be fraudulent. It's certainly not my expertise. But B, what we're interested in here today is what are the particular elements around lived experience of trauma? What is it that trauma brings to the table on top of all of the elements that have previously been talked about and are covered in the literature around co-production and the challenges and risks associated with general co-production? And then when we're thinking about co-production and power sharing in the context of lived experience of trauma, where, let's not forget, trauma most often happens in the context of relationships, and relationships where power is often happens. And so I think it's really important that we are taking this time, lived experience of trauma specifically in this context. Trauma and power, it's a really interesting dynamic. Dynamics of trauma can be brought into the dynamics of trying to share. So I'm going to talk about how we use that word share and really bring that to light. It's such a small word, seems so simple, and yet particularly when we think about the dynamics of trauma within the sharing can be a difficult thing to get right. Everybody can. And then the last bit of the definition is embedding into service design and processes. And this is where, you know, what I said earlier about services and organizations, I was about to say we, that's dreadful. I'm not representing an organization, but organizations bring their own risks too. And some in relation to their own organizational responses to trauma and adversity. When I was doing my clinical training, do your clinical 8 through 6 months in 6 different areas. First 2 years you rotate around children, young people services, adult services. And I was lucky enough to do my children and young people adolescent service. Somebody once said to me, you know, Caroline, you'll find out throughout your career that the services that you work in reflect the people that they serve. And so that you're coming into an adolescent service. And so you'll find that the people that you work with and the way in which the system operates is a bit adolescent. It's a bit, you know, reactive, it's a bit, you know, emotive, it's a bit, you know, you're dealing with this, and you're dealing with this, and you're dealing with this. But in part, that's kind of absorbed the people. Testing. I'll see how this works out. And actually, it's not always the case, of course not. But it is a known phenomenon where organizations are working with people who have experienced significant amounts of trauma and adversity, gradually get into a place where the chaos that not people, but the impact of adversity brings into people comes into the organization. And organizations then work to be able to manage that because they work in systemic ways that you know work for them. So we often talk about organisations and systems evolving in such a way for the system rather than the smooth running of it. Try to distance from. And that's what I mean in part by what systems and organisations might bring to the table in terms of the impact of trauma, as well as the many and very different traumatic that happen within. Look in the news at the moment, a range of different examples of those, how organisations respond to that. Is there around, this is what I need to do to stay safe, this is what I need to survive. So it's the own impact. Somebody's just said the sound quality is getting worse. Is that me? Is that the system? How is everybody? Can you step in?
I do think, Caroline, see if you speak louder, it seems to be more, it's picking it up more. Okay. Yeah, I think so. Cheers.
Let me just see whether I can do something to my device setting, just in case something that's, no, I was doing the balloon exercise the other day, and I will try and speak louder, but you can probably hear that my throat is just a little bit challenged at the moment, just from having done too much delivery of training. So I will try and speak up. So I think the other thing that I want to say before getting into the impact of trauma is we're talking about risk today. Of course we are, but let's not negate the fact that what is the biggest risk here? The biggest risk here is if we don't do it, we're losing the opportunities. So let's talk about first the opportunities that come from power sharing. And we all know that, right? That if we're not doing this, if we're not doing it properly, if we're just doing it without genuinely thinking about the impact of trauma and bringing every voice of trauma into the picture, then we're losing out. And I'm going to talk about the impact of the window of tolerance and how we might, amplify certain voices and reduce other voices and the dangers of that. And so I think it's really important to say that the opportunities outweigh the risks in terms of having a genuine understanding of the impact of trauma that people who don't come with lived experience are completely blind to. And I have firsthand experience of that in some of the justice work that I've been doing. We did interviews with a whole range of different victims and witnesses affected by trauma about their experience of the justice system and what they needed from staff in terms of responding in a trauma-informed way. Now, at the same time, I was doing a whole bunch of lit reviews around the evidence to bring those two things together. And hands down, the meat and substance that those interviews with victims and witnesses was not evidenced. Much of what they were talking about was not necessarily evidenced in the literature, and it really brought substance to them. And so the huge risk, if I had gone ahead and done what I probably in one part of me wanted to do, which is just go into a darkened room, read the literature and type up a knowledge and skills framework, it would have been much less effective. And so the risks of not doing this far outweigh the risks of doing it. So we have to keep those opportunities at the front. And so just a little bit on, okay, what is the risks that lived experience of trauma brings to the table? And I want to be really clear, this is not what people bring to the table, it's what the impact of trauma on people and on organisations. So if we want to genuinely be power sharing, we have to actively recognise and proactively adapt to what we know is normal human and organisational adaptations to the impact. So the surviving, which is what Sandra Ferguson often refers to it as. We've got to do what we have to do. We've got to adapt to traumatic things. So if trauma is happening to us within a relationship, our understanding of relationship changes to take that into account. But that understanding of relationships that we come out with, like power is bad, I've got to wrestle it off people in every way that I can, because otherwise I'm in danger, or I need to run away from power as much as I can because I know that when I'm in a situation where someone has power over me, it's really dangerous for me. That's called surviving the surviving. You've survived it at the time, but when you bring those beliefs into the world, when the impact of trauma does that, you then have to survive that, and that part is the bit that can make this process quite difficult. And so we have to welcome and be prepared for trauma responses at the table. Dan Hughes talks about naming it to tame it. So any systems have to be able to name this rather than run away for it and go, right, okay, trauma's at the table now. What are we doing to think about that? And as a system and as a whole, we need to be able to have that shared understanding and be able to label it without shame, without stigma and all. And so once it's named, we can recognise the risk that it poses and it's safer. We can think about it together. And what are those risks? Well, just a little bit. I can see Samantha looking at the clock. I think that's what you're doing. I don't know. That's my kind of, that's my radar. I promise I won't take up too much more time. One of the things I wanted to talk about is we talk about the window of tolerance, that we were hopefully in this room, we're all fairly well versed in that, you know, when we experience significant amounts of trauma, we end up having potentially quite a narrow green zone, because we either need to flip into the red zone to manage danger, or we need to flip into the blue zone to really kind of psychologically manage where we're at and sort of zone out from it. But what that means is some of us might be more easy to slip into the red zone, where we experience a power dynamic that we're unhappy with, to say, this is not cool, and here's why it's not cool, and this is what I'm really struggling with. And that can be really frightening for people whose blue zone is actually a much more comfortable place. So we have different strategies from lived experience of trauma that trauma brings to the table, and each of those can scare each other. So someone who's in the blue zone, very quiet, not saying very much, not engaging, can be equally as scary to someone who's in the red zone going, what's that person thinking? What's going on over there? What's happening over there? And so both can be really tricky to manage. In terms of the systemic approach, we also really risk, from an organizational perspective, really amplifying the voices of people who are more red zoned and really negating the voices of people who are more blue zoned. And that can really bring about into play the dynamics of trauma in terms of not listening to or heroing and then catastrophizing when that doesn't work. So we need to think about, how do we keep the process within its window of tolerance and expect those things to happen and have plans for when they do. And equally, an organization can be completely outside of its window of tolerance as well. And so it's not able to hold that. We talk about the safe base. So as a system and process, we have to hold this safe base. So it's safe to be able to recognize, I think we're a bit red zoned here, guys, or I think we're a bit blue zoned here, or I think there's a whole swathe of voice that we're not hearing because it might be blue zoned. And it's our job to be able to amplify that. How are we going to do? And the other thing that I'm going to come to is the impact of trauma and abuse on how we relate to others. And this can be a really tricky thing to talk about. So I think it's important to put it in its place, which is, this is not about people. This is about the impact of trauma on people. And in doing that and naming it to tame it, we're then putting it in its place and going, I think the impact of trauma is having an influence here on how we're relating to each other. And we need to think about that a little bit. This is complex. We could do a whole day on this, but the dynamics of interpersonal abuse and trauma and how we evolve to get our needs met and to survive in the context of trauma, let's expect that to come to the table and let's plan. And that's not just the people with lived experience who come to our table, it's also the organisation coming to the table. Both need to look at and reflect on that. Sometimes trauma makes us fight to get our needs met and fight with others, and that's an interpersonal dynamic. Sometimes it's flight, sometimes it's that blue. When we experience coercion or abuse of power over a lengthy period, power can become a really poisoned chalice for us. And so the word power sharing is deceptively simple, but really hard to do. Some people just want to throw power as far away as they can, get away from it. And some people want to hold it really, really tight. Both of that is about surviving kind of coercive, disempowering environment, actually. But that throwing around of power, of grabbing it, of throwing it, can feel really dangerous and be really dangerous and be especially dangerous for actually just trying to get stuff done. Trying to get stuff done while that power is going around the room and you're trying to adapt to it. So that needs to be named to be tamed. So how do we create genuinely power sharing systems rather than power throwing systems, power grabbing systems that take account of the impact of trauma? And I haven't even started really on how organizations are kind of used to grabbing the power and used to being in power. And so sometimes they can feel a bit like, oh God, we've got to give all the power here, as opposed to we've got to set up a genuinely safe place where that power sits and isn't pulled and grabbed. Or if it is, it's named and taken. And so avoiding some of the dynamics of abuse, not silencing views if they don't fit with our agenda as an organisation, not placing on a pedestal those whose views do cohere with our views and the ones that we want to, but genuinely a place where both of those can emerge in those discussions. No unwitting coercion or silencing of those whose views don't fit, but also standing up to those who may be red zoning and going, this is the most important view to take into account. How do we balance those things? We don't have the answers, but I think if we're naming it, then we can work together to tame it. And the last thing is, I think we absolutely need to expect rupture on all sides. I've written down here rupture on both sides, but actually this isn't a black and white, them and us, you know, we're the lived experience and we're the organisation. It's absolutely not. when we recognize a rupture, when we recognize something is happening, rather than it getting to red and everybody just goes and the whole process breaks, it doesn't continue. How do we name it to tame it at amber? And everything that I've just spoken about there, that's what it's about. If we come to the table with an expectation that trauma is going to be at the table, then we can get it before it goes red. And so to summarize, if we want to make this simple, it's not simple really, is it? Shamela would kill me if I tried to say this is a simple. It's not, but it is the 6 R's of trauma-informed practice. It really is. Recognize, realize the prevalence, realize that everyone around that table is probably bringing something in terms of their little partner with trauma, sitting at the table with them. Recognize what that's likely to bring to your process of the changes that you're trying to bring about. And then, and this is the really critical one, respond with that understanding and know it's there at the table, accept it, don't try and throw it away. And then resist re-traumatization. And that is really, I could have spent all of just now talking about resisting re-traumatization, but I'm fairly sure we're all fair. Relationships, and relationships matter. And the resilience, and this comes back to the opportunities, the resilience that the impact of trauma brings to the table. I've just talked about all the risks, but also the resilience that people at that table, despite their previous experiences of trauma, and despite their experiences of being disempowered potentially in relationships, let's invite that resilience to the table. Never once have I regretted, even though it's been a complex process, the process of making sure that we are hearing the voice of lived and not just hearing it, but thinking, what does this mean, and working together to integrate it into the. So I'm not sure whether that was exactly what you expected from this bit, but really what I wanted to do was to highlight, this is some of the things that are going to come to the table that are going to pose risks as well as opportunities, and we need to take that. So I think I'll finish there. Thank you very much for inviting me as a light fraud to this discussion.